So as of this recording, it's March 2020, and the Tesla Model Y deliveries are way ahead of schedule, and the first customers will be getting their hands on their cars in just a matter of days. By the way, if you have one of these cars and you want us to take a look or do a review, please reach out to us. But we think this car is going to be the most important car of the decade, maybe the last 2 decades. And it will be the car that brings Tesla to a whole new level of profitability. And that's what we're talking about today. I don't want to sound like I'm over exaggerating, but this car is seriously that important. The Model Y is going to be the biggest car this year. So that's what we're talking about today. But as always, before we begin, thank you so much for watching. If you're new, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss our future videos. We're a channel dedicated to the future of technology, energy, and transportation. I'm Ricky, and this is 2-Bit Da Vinci. All right, so the Tesla Model Y. I think this car has flown under the radar. I think the news media coverage has picked back up because we're days away from deliveries. But the Model Y kind of flew under the radar for the last couple of months because the Cybertruck came along and all the other news. And I think part of that is because it looks really similar to the Model 3. But this is going to be one of the main reasons why I think this car is going to be highly successful and why this car is way ahead of schedule in terms of deliveries. If you look back to the Model 3, the first time Tesla had mass-produced a car, they had all kinds of ramp-up problems and production hell, and their car was delayed by quite a bit. This time around, it's the opposite. They are ahead of schedule and flying high. I would just first remind everybody that Tesla is a really new company. You can imagine it's not that hard to go from the 7th generation Honda Civic to the 8th generation Honda Civic. Just make a couple of tweaks and that's pretty easy. But to mass produce a brand new car is a challenge, especially for a young company. So first and foremost, bravo and props to the team at Tesla, Elon Musk. The Model Y is going to be huge. In fact, their millionth car produced was a red Tesla Model Y. Pretty cool. So now let's talk about why the Model Y is such a huge deal for Tesla. First and foremost, from reports I've heard, it shares up to 75% of the same components as the Model 3. That means you don't have to go make new door handles and mirrors and center consoles and seats and taillights and headlights. A lot of that stuff is actually shared. That really drives down the non-recurring costs. When you're building something, you have non-recurring and recurring costs. A non-recurring cost would be the engineering time to AutoCAD up designs and to do crash testing and to do all the stuff that you don't have to do once you've finished it. Then there's the recurring cost, which would be buying aluminum and metal and welding robots and running the factories to build and produce cars. Those costs are incurred for every car you make. But the non-recurring costs are dramatically slashed for the Model Y because 3/4 of the car have already been designed. It's just a matter of pumping out a few more from the factory. So for that reason, their profit margin is going to be way higher. And this move is pretty brilliant. I think when the Model Y was first announced, I thought, oh, okay, it looks like a Model 3 but raised. I wasn't like blown away by the design. I love the Model 3 and I love the Model Y, but it wasn't radical in any way. And that was probably a smart reason because this is just their second mass-produced car, and I think the Model Y will be their most successful car. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But they've come a long ways, and in their manufacturing processes, that will drive the cost even lower. So first and foremost, sharing 3/4 of all the parts with the Model 3 means an easier ramp up, lower cost, and part sharing, easier logistics, and overall lower cost. So to switch gears and talk about some of Tesla's optimizations that they've made in manufacturing, I'm actually joined by one of my viewers, Anthony. Anthony, you want to say hello?
So yeah, hi Ricky. First of all, thanks for inviting me on to talk about some of the manufacturing advances at Tesla. A bit of background about myself before we start. I'm a freelance industrial designer, and I've been in many factories in China and Europe, so I work quite closely with my clients and their development teams. So as a bit of background for the Model 3 and all cars really, they're usually made with a pressing or stamping process. So you take a sheet of material and you deform it into a shape. So this is a video of the Fremont factory, and you see there's a lot of automation. You need multiple presses and multiple robots to move each pressed part to a different part of the factory, and then they're eventually all welded together, but we'll talk about that in more detail later. So you can see that the Model 3 is constructed from a number of different materials. So there's aluminium, there's mild steel in the blue, high strength steel in the yellow, and ultra high strength steel in red. And so all of these parts are either pressed or some of them folded. I think there's one extrusion in there. And then the steel parts are welded together, but it's very, very difficult to combine steel and aluminium. So slide 11, you'll see at the bottom left, the aluminium part, just how complex that part is. So it's a series of pressed or stamped parts that are welded together, and it's incredibly complex. This takes a lot of time, a lot of processes. There's a lot of criticism of the Model 3 body from Sandy Munro, who's pretty renowned in this field. I believe he was in favour of just using steel throughout the entire body because it was such a high volume product. Quite a while later, Elon Musk gave a response to this on Twitter, of course, and saying Munro's analysis of Tesla engineering is accurate, both in terms of pros and cons. I think he will appreciate some elements of the Model Y body design. A little bit before that tweet, he'd gone on the Rider Lightning podcast and he'd discussed bringing this rear underbody down from 70 parts to 1. So a series of 70 stamped parts to a single die casting. I believe he said it will go from 70 parts to 2 with 2 fasteners, and then 70 parts to 1 when they get the big casting machine. The machine will be bigger than the car, absolutely. This shows it's a great little instructional video that shows the basic process of die casting. It's very similar to injection molding in a lot of ways. So you're forcing molten material from a barrel into a mold. So it's really different to the taking a sheet of material and deforming it in a stamping tool or a pressing tool, or if they're doing it in a completely different location altogether. So in the financial report, actually, there's some interesting images that were shown, which are kind of teasers, I think. You see the part that is actually die cast. So it's this rear underbody. These ribs that are shown, you get those through die casting. So yeah, there's not so much information out there on these techniques. There's a little bit on websites, but the only video explanations I can find are from this guy Peter Thomson's YouTube channel, and they're pretty good, definitely worth checking out. I believe he's a university lecturer in technology, so definitely worthwhile checking out his channels. So he's detailed that the rear underbody actually comes quite a long way forward. You can see in the parts that he's highlighted in this kind of cyan colour. He did mention that there might be a casting in the front as well, but from what I can see, it still looks like a series of pressings that are welded together in the image. But for sure, we'll see when Mr. Munro tears down the first Model Y, whether they've gone with a series of pressings there or whether they've actually gone with die castings too. Yeah, so here it's just showing that the Model Y in the body shop. So we can see that, at least for the majority of the Model Y, we're still talking about pressed parts. So it's not the whole vehicle that is die cast. So it's interesting because they've brought over a lot from Model 3 to Model Y. They look very, very similar. The Model Y is obviously a little bit bigger. There's more practicality there. But underneath the skin, there are some really big improvements to the manufacturing process and cost and efficiency, potentially. This is where it gets really interesting, actually, potentially beyond the Model Y. This Tesla patent application, the title is Multi-Directional Unibody Casting Machine for a Vehicle Frame and Associated Method. Multiple portions of the vehicle frame may be integrally formed or casted without the need for further assembly and attachment. Example, welding, rivets, etc. That's exactly what Sandy Munro was criticising in the Model 3.
Right.
The need to kind of rivet aluminium parts and steel parts together. And then the second one, the side, roof, front and rear portions of the vehicle frame are configured to be integrally formed within the mold cavity by the casting machine. So this is way beyond what they're doing for Model Y, and it points to something much, much, much bigger and quite ambitious, actually.
A third example of how they've really optimized the design and manufacturing process for the Model Y is something maybe you haven't thought of before, but that is the wiring harness. As you can imagine, a car is 10 feet long and there's electronics running throughout the entire length of it. Take, for example, turning on your left blinker. You hit the stalk on the steering column, and as a result, the left blinker in the front of the car and the back of the car begins to blink. You have to have wires that run the length of the car to the back under the seats and to the left blinker, and maybe even to the trunk lid if there's a blinker on there. That sort of thing expands to everything about the car, the speakers in the back, lock mechanisms and restraints and everything else. So a conventional wiring harness for a car is a really complicated thing. And historically, Tesla's had trouble automating it because these are finicky, thin wires and you have to run them through small areas. And so this is something that historically that humans have done. I think Tesla tried to automate a lot of this with the Model 3 and they found it was such a hard time that it was way easier to just have people do it. The original Model S had about 3 kilometers of wiring. So that means if you took all the wires running out the entire length of the Tesla Model S and you laid it end to end, you'd be at 3 kilometers, almost 2 miles in length. For the Model 3, they improved upon that dramatically, reducing the complexity and the number of wires and harnesses down to just about 1.5 kilometers, less than a mile. And now with the Model Y, they're saying that the entire wiring harness is about 100 meters, which is a reduction of 15 times compared to the Model 3. So what have they done? What they've done is they've moved, I believe, to a more rigid wiring harness where they have big wires that run the length of the car, but then from there they have control modules. So rather than having direct wiring for power, neutral, signal wires to every component light bulb switch, now maybe you can have little controllers that you can send signals to, and from there the signal is relayed. Imagine, for example, if you have a home network and a router in your living room, and you want to run 5 new Ethernet port cables into your office. You could run 5 50-foot wires to the office, or you can run one to a switch, and from the switch you could run 4 or 5 ports from there. That would reduce the amount of wiring that you would have to create by a huge factor. And I think this is what people are saying that they've done. I'm not entirely sure about the details of this just yet, but as soon as we find out more, we'll cover it. But the other thing as well is even though we have a huge battery pack in the Tesla Model 3, the Tesla Model 3 has a 12-volt battery like a conventional car. And this is for running things like your cigarette lighter and other things that are 12-volt. But for the Model Y, they're ditching the 12-volt battery entirely. And I believe they're moving to a 48-volt architecture. And so why the higher 48-volt system is important is because if you have a higher voltage, then the resulting amps you have to push through the wire can be lower. Because the amps times the volts will give you the wattage that you need. So if you have more volts, then you need less current. And that means the wires can be thinner as well. So there's a lot of optimizations that they've made, and don't be surprised if the manufacturing can be more automated for the wiring harness and that the Model Y costs are even lower. So shared components with the Model 3 and a parts bin that's already been created for them to choose from, that's a huge advantage. Number 2, new manufacturing optimizations with die cast instead of having multiple stamps that have to be riveted together. And number 3 is a huge reduction in the length and amount of wiring in their wiring harness. These are the sorts of things that companies get to learn from. This is why iterating on a product is so much easier than building it from scratch. The Model 3 was a wholly new thing. They had to redesign a car from scratch. It didn't take too much from the Model S because the Model S was never built to be mass produced. The 3 was. And the Model Y is very much the same way, except they have all those lessons learned. You got to remember too that back when they first started with the Model 3, they had some issues where the road noise was a little bit loud. They had other little fit and finish issues. And by 2020, when I took delivery of my car, they had made huge improvements. And they don't just wait yearly to make improvements. They make improvements to the assembly line on a monthly or quarterly basis. They're always updating and improving the process. And the really cool part is the Model Y begins with every advancement and every improvement they made to the Model 3 on day one. So the Model Y begins with all of that already sorted out, and moving forward, it'll get better and better still. So we haven't really talked too much about the specs of the car, but the Model Y has some really impressive range. For one, the long range model will have a range of 315 miles, they're reporting, and the performance model with the performance add-ons, which is the bigger 21-inch wheels, the lowered ride height, and the higher top speed, that drops the range from 315 to about 280. And having a Model 3 performance, I can attest to this being pretty accurate. But even still, it'll have the same 75 kilowatt hour battery pack, and the prices will come in at around $53,000 for the long range and $61,000 for the performance model. Now, if you are a reservation holder for the standard range model, you're going to have to wait until 2021. Their strategy for manufacturing this car is very similar to the Model S as well, where they're going to make the higher margin, more expensive cars first to start the ramp up, and then slowly, as they can get the numbers up to over 5,000 a week or whatever their number target is, then they're going to start building the standard range car as well. Also, if you remember the unveil, they had 7 adults hop out of the car, showing off the fact that the Model Y actually has a third row. It's a really tiny third row from what I can gather, but it has a third row. If you're going to buy that configuration, which I'd be tempted to myself, that will also require you waiting until 2021. So the people getting their cars in the next few days, here March 2020, are going to be the people who have the long range or performance variations of the car. Tesla is going to sell a bunch of these cars, and they're going to make a much better profit per car than even the Model 3, which was pretty good. There's another factor at play that I wanted to talk about, and that's what makes this car so important. Clearly, it's important for Tesla and very profitable for Tesla. But why I say this car is the most important car of the decade is because of a trend in the automotive industry where everybody is ditching their sedans in favor of crossovers and SUVs. So if we look at data from December of 2019, which is pretty indicative for the year and recent trends, crossovers combined for 40.8% of all car sales in December 2019. That's a huge number. The next biggest segment was pickup trucks at 17.9%. If you take small cars, around 11%, mid-size cars, 10%, and luxury cars, 5%, large cars, 1%, you're still at around 28%. And that number is falling. So crossovers, pickups, and sport utility vehicles. A sport utility vehicle is a bigger SUV still on a truck platform like the Toyota Sequoia or like a GMC Suburban. So why this matters is in the last 20 years, we've had some positive reductions in our carbon emissions with better fuel economy from cars like the Toyota Prius and hybrids and now electric cars. But there's a problem. If you take all the new hybrid cars that are getting a little bit better gas mileage, they don't even come close to offsetting the new lower fuel economy numbers of crossovers and SUVs. So as we're getting more fuel efficient cars, that's being dwarfed by the fact that we have way more crossovers. The Toyota RAV4 and the Honda CR-V are two of the best selling in this segment, and these cars sell 300,000 plus units a year each. So this is a huge market, and the Tesla Model Y will be competing with these cars. Now, these cars are going to be cheaper, starting around $26,000 maybe, but by the time you add all the self-driving features and the safety and the sensors, maybe leather seats and other amenities, you might very well be close to Tesla Model Y territory, maybe a little bit cheaper, but you can't argue with the super low cost of ownership numbers. For us here in San Diego, if you own an EV, you can charge it at night for 9 cents per kilowatt hour. That means that driving a Model Y will be cheaper by a factor of 4 or 5 times compared to a Honda CR-V or a Toyota RAV4. So we started to require better fuel economy numbers, right? The average sedan, the Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla or a Camry, can get easily over 35 miles a gallon, but the average crossover is going to get 25 miles a gallon. So that reduction is really why the Model Y, I think, is huge. This need for bigger cars is not a fad. It's not going anywhere. I think the crossover is going to completely shadow sedan sales. There's going to be some people who prefer a sedan. I like the sedan more than the crossover because I like the low seating height and the more sporty feel, but I'm in the minority. More people prefer the crossover for more room for their dogs or their animals or their kids, more room to go for picnics and travel and all that stuff. And that's why I think the Model Y is going to be huge for Tesla. Tesla is really ramping up. They've sent out letters to people saying, hey, you're in line for a third row Model Y, but if you go for a non-third row Model Y, we can get you a car like this month. They're trying to get their numbers up for this quarter and for this year and come out swinging because they no longer have the tax credit, and people are going to say, oh, let's see how well Tesla does without their tax credit incentives from the federal government. And I'll tell you right now, the numbers from what I'm seeing on Twitter and the interest, it's going to be huge. They're going to sell hundreds of thousands of these cars, maybe even this year, and their ramp for the Model Y is going to be a breeze. They've already pretty much reached the levels they need to. I'm not sure what their numbers are just yet. We'll report on more of that as we find it. But I have no doubt that they're making these things very profitably and very effectively. Some people have said that the Model 3 will suffer as a result. I can maybe see that. There's probably some buyers who are thinking, oh, I'd rather have the Y. But at the same time, I don't know. I think the Model 3 is a different kind of category. You can think, even though they're very similar and there's more in common than not, I think the Model 3 still is kind of the BMW 3 Series fighter. I think the Model 3 Performance, for example, is the best sports sedan you can buy today, especially around $60,000. There's really nothing else that even comes close, in my opinion. But the Y is a different animal. And yes, there's a performance Model Y, which is going to be just insane. There's no competition for that. And in fact, speaking of competitors, the BMW iX3, which they were planning as a crossover electric car for the US, has just been canceled. So they are not launching that in the US. So what does Tesla actually have in terms of competitors? Well, Jaguar I-Pace, possibly. But that's a more expensive car. Audi e-tron, more expensive car. Those cars start around $70,000, whereas the Model Y can be had for about $50,000. And it'll get even cheaper when the Standard Range Plus comes around. And honestly, I think Tesla's name brand, I think they're going to sell way better than either of those cars. Plus, they've both had battery supply problems and issues. And the Model Y, I think, is slated for a smooth ramp in terms of batteries, along with the manufacturing of the cars themselves. So with some of the negative news with the health scare going on right now, the Tesla stock is pretty low. And if you're thinking, I have some Tesla stock, should I keep them or sell them? I would say if you can, consider buying some more. I think Tesla is going to be, if they were around $900 earlier, I think they're going to be well on their way to over $1,000 a share. Again, I'm not a financial advisor. What you do with your money is your own business. But just looking at this car, I think the significance of the Model Y is absolutely enormous. And I don't think people fully understand just how important this car is. If there was an electric crossover, the kind of car that everybody's looking to buy, and you could have it for not that much more money than the competitors, I think the value proposition just can't be ignored. And that is why I think the Model Y is going to be the biggest car and the most important car of the decade. So what do you guys think? Do you agree? Disagree? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment. Let's start a conversation. I'd love to know where you guys are at. For anybody who's getting delivery of a Model Y, please write to me. I would love to talk to you. Maybe we can just do a phone call or a web chat. But I'd love to know your thoughts, and maybe we can do a review and do a video together. But if you have one of these cars, write to us. And even if you don't, just leave us a message and let us know what you guys think. A special thanks to our patrons on Patreon. If you are looking for another way to support us and you want to be a rock star supporter of this show, consider joining us on Patreon. Huge thanks to everyone who's been supporting us. It really helps us to do some of the future videos that we have planned, and you're going to see very soon. We have a lot of exciting, more documentary style videos planned for the future. So hit that subscribe button and join us. You don't want to miss out. And thank you so much for watching. Again, this is Ricky with Tuba Da Vinci, and we will catch you guys on the next one.